Hi, my name is Chris Quarto, and I'm a professor in the Professional Counseling Program at Middle Tennessee State University. I'm glad you could join me for my presentation entitled Providing Solution-Focused Supervision in a Developmental Framework. This is a continuing education program for supervisors of students in counselor education programs. There are three objectives of this presentation. First, by the end of this presentation, you should be able to explain the differences between counselor supervisees who are at different levels of skill development. Secondly, you should also be able to explain different approaches to use in your role as a supervisor based on supervisees' level of development and the issues they discuss with you in supervision. And finally, you should be able to employ different techniques in supervision based on the solution-focused approach to help supervisees enhance their growth as professional counselors. Let me begin by making some opening remarks about supervision because it's easy to have preconceived notions about what it entails. Generally speaking, there are two types of supervision. The first type is administrative supervision. Prior to the beginning of practicum or an internship experience, the university instructors or coordinators may meet with site supervisors to review the program's expectations for students and supervisors. Usually this has to do with things like ensuring that students obtain enough direct service hours and document their activities while they're at the site, ensuring that students are engaging in record keeping, and discussing with supervisors forms or documents they'll need to complete on students as part of the evaluation process. And so one of the supervisor's roles is to ensure that supervisees comply with the policies and procedures of the practicum or internship class, as well as those of the site itself. All of these things are important, but aren't the key elements of helping students develop into competent counselors. The other type of supervision is clinical supervision. Clinical supervision is designed to help supervisees develop their counseling skills, learn more about themselves in relation to the counseling process, and develop their professional identities as counselors. You know, this is one of the only times in students' careers that they'll have the opportunity to participate in supervision that's this intense and requires them to engage in a lot of self-reflection and practice. In a real sense, you're the link between the student and the university that ensures that students have developed a core set of skills to practice their trade with the public. And that's an awesome responsibility when you think of it. Okay, with that in mind, let me tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'm going to ask you a question. Every so often I teach the practicum course at MTSU, and this is a course where students work with real clients for the first time. So of course they're all excited because they've been preparing for this for a long time, but they're also nervous. They're hoping that things go okay when they see their clients. And so all the students meet with me for individual and group supervision on a weekly basis because they need a lot of direction and support during a critical phase of their training program, and I'm more than happy to do this. Counseling supervision has always been one of my professional passions, and the reason I'm so passionate about this is because I've had some really fantastic supervisors and some really lousy supervisors, and each of them impacted me in a positive and negative way. Isn't it interesting how the things that people are the most passionate about tend to be based on experiences that have had a dramatic impact on their lives? Did you ever have a lousy supervisor? If you did, what made them lousy? You know, many years ago, there were some counselor educators who actually conducted research in this area, and they discovered a series of characteristics that made for lousy supervisors, and they grouped these characteristics into three categories. First category was organizational administrative. And in this category, the lousy supervisors failed to clarify expectations. They failed to provide standards for accountability and also to assess supervisee needs. And they also failed to adequately be prepared for supervision sessions. The second category is technical cognitive. In this case, lousy supervisors were perceived as unskilled practitioners, They were also perceived as unskilled supervisors and as unreliable, and these supervisors provided vague and abstract feedback. The last category is relational affective. The lousy supervisors in this case gave too much or too little affirming feedback. Now think about that for a second. Why would giving a supervisee too much affirming feedback be thought of in a negative term by supervisees? They also gave too much or too little corrective feedback. They failed to provide an emotionally safe supervision environment and also showed insensitivity to the developmental needs of supervisees. There were times, for example, when supervisors of less experienced supervisees assumed that supervisees were more knowledgeable or skilled than they really were, and therefore didn't provide them with the structure and support that they needed. Now, generally speaking, one of your major goals as a supervisor is to help supervisees develop their skills as professional counselors, and if you do a good job, they'll feel more confident, and that confidence will give them the emotional fuel they need to develop their skills. You know, it's not like supervisees wake up one morning and feel confident. I mean, just think back to your own development as a counselor and all those learning experiences that you went through to get to where you are now. Remember how awkward and uncomfortable you felt while you were going through all those growing pains? It really does take time to feel as though you have a handle on things. Now, one thing that I've always found to be helpful in my own development as a counselor and a supervisor is to identify critical incidents that occurred in supervision that were turning points in my development as a counselor, and I'd like to do that right now. What I'd like you to do is to think about one thing that you may have struggled with early on in your development as a counselor, or perhaps more recently, and how a supervisor or colleague may have helped you turn the corner. And if you can't identify a single critical incident, then just think in general what helped you overcome the difficulty. Now, the supervisor may have been a professor, or it could have been a site supervisor at a clinic or school, or maybe it was a principal or a colleague. Just think about what they said or did that helped you turn that corner. Why don't you go ahead and pause the video at this point so you can think about this. Now keep this in mind and realize that your supervisees are going to be struggling with things. Maybe not the same things that you did, but struggling nonetheless. And your job is to help them figure out a way to turn the corner, just like your supervisor or colleague did for you. Now, if you're going to be supervising students, or even more experienced counselors for that matter, it's a good idea to have a framework or model that'll guide you when you provide supervision. And one of the easiest models to understand is the developmental model of supervision. What this model does is describe counselor growth as a series of sequential or orderly stages, and each one of these stages requires a different supervisory approach. You know, one of the things we know based on research in developmental psychology is that people pass through certain psychological stages as they develop and mature. And each stage provides the person with a different set of glasses to view their experiences and to attach meaning to those experiences. And this is the same thing that happens with supervisees. They all go through different stages of development, and what's happening is that their understanding of themselves and the counseling process gradually becomes more sophisticated and complex as they gain counseling experience. You know, it's kind of like if you asked a child to explain a terrorist attack to you, like the September 11th, 2001 attack. All the child knows is that some guys crashed 2 planes into the Twin Towers, and when you ask him why they did this, he says, because they're bad. A very simplistic response. Now, adults know that there's more to it than that. But it would be difficult to explain these things to kids because so many of the issues are abstract. This is the same thing that happens with students that you supervise. It's almost like they have to have direct experiences with certain events before they really understand all of the issues that are involved in helping people solve their problems. Over the course of time, you'll end up using different supervisory interventions to address different needs that supervisees experience in their development as professional counselors. And just like parents use different approaches when disciplining kids and teenagers. Now let me say a few things about beginning level supervisees first, who are usually practicum students or students who are getting their feet wet, so to speak. You know, beginning level supervisees are usually apprehensive about supervision at first because they know their work is being evaluated, which they're not too sure about to begin with. And they're beginning to realize that this counseling thing is for real and they've got to produce. You know, one of the things that I have them do in our supervision sessions, and I'm not unique in this sense, is to play audio or video recordings of their counseling sessions for review and discussion. Did you ever have to do that when you were being trained as a counselor? Well, I can tell you, and you may know this from personal experience, that it's really unnerving for supervisees to do this at first because they already feel awkward and uncomfortable when they're working with clients. But to have to relive this again when they listen to or watch recordings of a session with you, that can be really anxiety-provoking. But there's a shift that occurs later on. As supervision progresses over the course of a semester, supervisees learn how to tolerate their anxiety of listening to or watching the recordings. And I think that tolerance comes from knowing that something good is going to come out of this, that their skills are going to improve. At least that's what will happen if you're doing your job as a supervisor. Let me say a few more things about listening to or watching recordings. This approach to supervision was first used by a guy named Kagan in the 1960s, and he called his approach interpersonal process recall. And basically the way it works is that anytime either person, the supervisor or the supervisee, thinks that something of significance is happening on the recording, they can stop it and discuss their thoughts or feelings or impressions of what was happening at that point in the counseling session. And what you're trying to do as a supervisor when you use this technique is to help supervisees increase their self-awareness and their awareness of the counseling process by directing their attention to dynamics that are going on within them or dynamics that might be underlying interactions between themselves and their clients, things that you know are important and want supervisees to know or learn. Now, here are some questions that you can ask supervisees as part of this interpersonal process recall approach. What do you think the client was trying to say? How do you think the client was feeling at this point? Can you pick up on any clues from his nonverbal behavior? What was running through your mind when the client said that? Can you recall some of the feelings that you were having then? Did anything prevent you from sharing your feelings or concerns with the client? And I like this one. If you had another chance, would you like to have said something different? And I call that one the hindsight is 20/20 question. What kind of risk would you have taken if you had said what you really wanted to say? And then what kind of a person do you want the client to see you as? You know, one thing that makes training experiences so stressful for supervisees is that they're trying out a lot of new things, responses, techniques, treatment plans, in situations that they've never encountered before. And you've got to expect that they are really going to rely on you for advice and direction. Now let me give you another analogy to illustrate this point. Oftentimes when you see a parent take their toddler someplace unfamiliar for the first time, like a doctor's office or a stranger's house, the toddler will stick close to the parent and just kind of scope out the place. But eventually they'll either get bored or curious and wander off and do a lot of exploring, but come back to mom or dad soon afterwards to make sure that they're still there. In other words, they need that emotional refueling. But once that happens, they'll run off and do some more exploring, but maybe for a little longer this time because they're feeling more comfortable in their surroundings. Well, this is very similar to how beginning supervisees will react. And since this is the case, you can expect that when you ask them to do something new and that new thing threatens their confidence, they'll typically respond in one of two ways. One is with dependence. So they might ask you, well, tell me how you would do this, or what would you do in this situation? Or they may only do things that are familiar or comfortable to them, like maybe relying exclusively on a particular counseling theory. So in both of these situations, there's an over-reliance on structure on their parts. And there's nothing wrong with this. It's what you would expect if you're viewing this from within a developmental context. You'll eventually want them to become more independent and flexible, but it's okay for them to lean on you at first. So point number one is this. When supervising beginning level supervisees, understand that their lack of experience and lack of self-knowledge means that they're going to be dependent on you for advice and direction, and that your role may fall in the realm of being a teacher and providing plenty of support and structure and supervision. Obviously, as supervisees gain more experience, they're learning more about themselves in the counseling process and may not need you to play the role of the teacher. In fact, it's quite possible that supervisees aren't going to perceive you as the expert who they have to consult with to figure out what to do with their clients or how to function in the school or clinic setting. When supervisees get to this point, they've usually accumulated enough counseling experience to start forming their own opinions about the counseling process and performing the roles of counselors, and so there's more of a striving to differentiate themselves from their supervisors. Keep in mind Erikson's theory of identity development in adolescence. Adolescents aren't necessarily going to grow up doing things the same way their parents did, and that's what you should expect and encourage in your supervisees. So basically, your role as a supervisor at this point would be to allow some flexibility in supervision sessions. Maybe let supervisees decide what they want to discuss in supervision and how they want to use the hour that you spend with them. And there's probably going to be a switch from the types of things that you work on with them in supervision too. They probably won't need as much help learning some of the more basic counseling skills like making paraphrases or how to start or end a counseling session as they do more advanced skills like case conceptualization. In other words, when you're talking to them about their clients, you might ask them to develop hypotheses about what might be contributing to their clients' problems, how they might approach the counseling process based on their conceptualization, and what they'll do if things don't go as planned. It's analogous to getting a child to move beyond a simple conception of bad guys attacking the Twin Towers and to educate them about all the different political and religious factors that led up to the attack. And I also think that a real important thing to be doing with these supervisees is to help them gain more self-awareness. In other words, help them identify their core beliefs, their biases, their behavioral tendencies, and how these things impact how they think about their clients' problems and interact with them. So for example, it's important for a supervisee who tends to be more timid to understand that when they get into a session with a domineering type of client, that it's going to be harder for them to challenge or confront the client because the client may know just which buttons to push to keep them from doing that. So point number 2 is that when supervising advanced supervisees, understand that they're getting to the point where they're developing a more sophisticated understanding about themselves as well as their clients and the counseling process, which you see reflected in higher level skills such as case conceptualization, and that their views of counseling may not necessarily jive with yours. And so your role becomes less instructive and more facilitative, You're still providing plenty of support, but in a different way. What you're doing is helping supervisees differentiate themselves from you. In other words, you're helping them become more independent so that they can develop their own unique views and styles of counseling. And so when they're demonstrating competencies, whether it's in terms of intervention skills, assessment skills, conceptualization skills, it's really getting to the point where supervisees don't need you as much for support and advice giving as much as they do to just bounce ideas off from you and help them solidify their own ideas about the counseling process. This is something that you normally see toward the end of the internship year. And so it's likely that the supervisor relationship is going to retain some of the same features of the middle stage for a period of time, and then change into a more collegial relationship once they've accumulated enough professional experiences. So point number 3 is this. When you're supervising supervisees with more counseling experience, realize that they already have a pretty good handle on the counseling process and how their personal dynamics affect interactions with clients. So your role is to interact with them on more of a peer level, and to be on the lookout for ways that you can continue enhancing their professional identity as counselors. Now that I've given you a general framework about supervisee development and supervision, let's take a look at how you can use ideas that are based on the solution-focused counseling approach when supervising students. If you're not familiar with this approach, it's a brief form of counseling that focuses more on what clients want as opposed to spending an inordinate amount of time talking about their problems. So unlike psychodynamic therapy or other forms of therapy, there's not an emphasis on things that have happened in the past, but more on what's happening now and what the client would like to see happen in the future. So in other words, how can the counselor help the client achieve their goals or get them to where they'd like to be? Solution-focused counseling is a positive and strengths-based counseling approach, and the concepts translate easily into supervision. During the initial supervision session, one of your goals will be to identify the supervisee's strengths. In other words, what is it that they'll be able to bring to counseling sessions that'll make those sessions effective, and how might they use those strengths in the future? These are things that you'll want to jot down and refer to later on in supervision sessions. Let's say that the supervisee says that she thinks one of her strengths is her ability to listen. And your response from a solution-focused approach might be something along the lines of, well, tell me how you'll use this skill in your first counseling session. And after the supervisee responds, you could ask follow-up questions to clarify her strengths or to encourage the supervisee to identify other strengths. Tell me what else you're good at that might help you in your first session with this client. You see, what we're trying to do at this point is to get the supervisee to think in terms of their strengths and how they can use these strengths to help the client to the fullest. And actually, doing this will help reduce their anxiety. And by doing this, you're creating a supervision environment where competence is inevitable. Another thing that's important to do is to help supervisees get a clear sense of what an effective counseling session looks like. And the reason this is so important is because they have to know what they're shooting for. It's kind of like when my son used to get a new Lego model. And the first thing he did before he began building the model was to look at the finished product on the box so he knew what it was supposed to look like when he was done. It's the idea of starting with the end in mind. So you ask, tell me what an effective counseling session will look like to you. What would you be doing in that session? Now you're at the point where you can help supervisees develop some goals. And you've got to realize that establishing goals is really important from the solution-focused perspective. It's what orients both counseling and supervision. Now, there are two types of goals that you can establish with supervisees. One type of goal is time specific. And this is something that you'll normally ask about in the first supervision session. And basically what supervisees need to do is state what goals they're going to accomplish within a specified time period. So for example, your supervisee might say, well, by the end of the semester, I'd like to have helped 3 clients through the relationship building, working stage, and termination phases of counseling. The other type of goal is session specific. And these goals are directly related to the supervisee's counseling within a single session. So a supervisee may say, well, during my session tomorrow, I'm going to try to use more reflections with my client, which is a reasonable goal for one counseling session. The important thing to remember is that whatever goals the supervisee develops, they need to pass the PMS rule. They need to be positive, meaningful, specific, and small. This is an important thing to emphasize to your supervisees, especially that goals are small, because smaller goals are more doable for clients. Sort of like how it's easier for a student to write a research paper if she divides the project into smaller chunks and knocks out one little piece at a time. Now, a good technique that you can use to help supervisees identify both time-specific and session-specific goals is the miracle question, which you're probably familiar with. So, for example, to identify time-specific goals, you might ask, if a miracle happened tonight and your skills improved faster than expected, what is the first thing you would notice yourself doing differently in your counseling sessions? And if the supervisee responded with something like, well, I'd be making better empathic responses, you'd want her to expand on that. I'm not sure what you mean. Tell me a little bit more about that so I can picture what you'd be doing. Remember, you're trying to help the supervisee develop a very clear and specific goal so they know what they're shooting for. Otherwise, it's kind of like they're driving their car in a fog. They kind of know what direction they have to head in, but they can't see far enough down the road to give them a firm sense of direction. Now, once supervisees identify time-specific goals, you'll want to help them identify exceptions to their concerns about their counseling skills and see if you can help them become aware of times when they actually demonstrated a goal behavior or at least came closer to demonstrating that behavior. Exceptions are situations in which a problem doesn't occur or occurs less often. So the key here is to find out what it was about the situation that allowed the supervisee to resolve a problem or an issue for at least a short period of time, because therein lies the solution to that problem. So for example, let's say that you're supervising someone who interrupts her clients all the time, and she tells you that when she was counseling a client today, she wasn't interrupting as much. So your question is, I wonder what was different about today's session. In other words, you put on your curiosity cap and try to help them identify exceptions to what they normally do that's problematic. And using the I wonder question is a great way to do that. Now let's say that another supervisee had a different goal. And this supervisee tends to talk too fast in his counseling sessions, so the goal is to slow down his rate of speech. So a way you could help the supervisee identify the exception in this case is by asking something like, well, when do you find that you're not talking too fast? And then once again, follow it up with, I wonder what's different about those times. If the supervisee indicates that he speaks slower when he talks to his friends than when he talks to clients, then you might ask, well, I wonder what it would take for you to talk as slowly to your clients as you do to your friends, and to have them discuss that. You see, your mindset as a supervisor from the solution-focused approach is to be on the continual search for exceptions to problems or issues. The next thing you'd want to do is to help the supervisee identify successful intervention or counseling behaviors that they've used during counseling sessions. So when the supervisee is telling you that she's been interrupting less often or that he's been slowing down the rate of his speech, once again, you put on your curiosity cap and ask, well, how did you do that? What was different about this session today? And by the way, supervisees won't always be able to answer these questions the first time you ask them. But what it does is prompt them to be more aware of this stuff in the future. The reason it's important, by the way, to ask these questions is that it encourages supervisees to think about the sequence of behaviors that help them to be successful, which you would encourage them to repeat in future counseling sessions. And the obvious benefit of doing this, which gets back to the whole developmental aspect of supervisees, is that it helps them develop a more sophisticated understanding of the counseling process. You know, beginning supervisees may have a vague sense of what was different, but you may have to take more of an active role in helping them figure this out. More advanced supervisees, remember, possess greater self-awareness, and they're able to look at their counseling sessions with greater understanding. So they're likely to be able to tell you what the difference was without much of an effort. And so after the supervisee who talks too fast thinks about it, he says, well, the last time I listened to my recording of a session with the client, I sounded like I was manic. I wanted to slow it down and sound more like James Bond. And so that's what I did today. And so a good follow-up question would be, well, tell me what you could do to continue to listen more closely to your clients instead of interrupting them. Or what would it take for you to talk more like James Bond in your sessions? You see, what you want to do is to encourage the supervisee to utilize these solutions more frequently and with other clients. In other words, you're going to try to get them to repeat the exceptions to their problems or issues. Now, it's always nice if you can help supervisees evaluate how well they're doing with respect to their goals in supervision, and this can be done by using what's called scaling questions. And basically what supervisees are asked to do is to rate themselves on a 10-point scale in terms of how closely they came to achieving their goal for a session. So for example, you could ask, on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 indicating no success and 10 indicating complete success, how would you rate yourself in terms of slowing down how fast you talked during your last counseling session? If the supervisee indicates a relatively high score, like a 6 or a 7, then you might want to compliment them and say something like, wow, it seems like being a James Bond imposter really paid off. I wonder what you'd have to do to continue doing that in your next session. Or, I wonder what would have to happen in order for you to move up a notch on that scale. So what happens after this is that at the beginning of each supervision session, supervisees are asked to report on improvements in their skills since the last supervision session, because once again, we're trying to get them to capitalize on successes and increase their strengths. Beginning supervisees are more likely to report successes in terms of how well they're implementing basic counseling skills like making paraphrases or reflections, while more advanced supervisees may pride themselves in being able to identify patterns contributing to clients' problems and implementing appropriate intervention strategies. So you could ask your supervisees something like, tell me how your counseling skills improved since our last supervision meeting. And you know, asking this kind of question each time promotes an expectation that their skills will improve, that it's inevitable. And it also encourages supervisees to view themselves in a constant state of development. And the other thing to remember is to ask questions that encourage your supervisees to discuss how they improve their skills and how they'll continue the momentum. That's what it's all about. This concludes my presentation on providing solution-focused supervision in a developmental framework. I hope that you found the presentation to be informative and instructive. Supervisors of MTSU professional counseling students are eligible to receive 1 continuing education credit through the National Board of Certified Counselors by responding to a brief set of questions pertaining to the material that I presented and returning it to me at cquarto@mtsu.edu. Thank you very much and have a great day.